And now, the astrology of the 2020s part 2, the second half of the discussion between Dan Waits and Andre Carr.
I wonder if maybe there's going to be some sort of face-off where there's a question of like, well, look, if we don't come to a settlement here, we're going to end up, in nuclear war or something like that. We have to come to a settlement rather than go to that place. And so my hope is that that's the kind of crucible, that's the cauldron that's kind of going to brew this sort of new settlement and maybe a new world. So that would mean that there's kind of a bit of a longer crisis that goes on until early 2030s, mid 2030s, and then it kind of resolves somehow. And then we're kind of, that's just a different kind of theory to Barbeau's vision. And maybe Barbeau is right. Maybe this kind of resolves itself early on. I don't know.
Well, it could be too that Barbeau can be right, and this can be right in the sense that if you look at the Cold War period, yes, that was definitely there in people's minds. And there were certainly, if we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was pretty scary. That's probably the scariest moment around everyone get under their desks, as if that's going to help type thing. But that's what was going on. But overall, the world was actually progressing and growing significantly in multiple ways. In fact, the 50s were, by many people's accounts, that's what these people that want to go back to making America great again, they want to go back to the 1950s, which of course is not a good idea for other reasons. But point being that we did survive that, and it could be that you could get a great period of expansion in one way and have this thing lurk in the background as well. Because, think of the 1980s. I remember that period. In the 1980s, yes, there was this thought that the US and Russia were on the brink. But lots of people just lived their lives. The 80s the US were this even crazier than the 70s. MTV started. It became this free-for-all. And if you mention nuclear war to those people, I don't think they were paying a whole lot of attention, even though in the background, yes, it was definitely super dangerous. So it's possible that we could have both of those simultaneously. Something I noted that's very interesting along your mention of the electron in 1891 and 82. So it occurred to me that the point where there would be great friction was at the semi-square, and that was 1930 to 33 of those two. And that's also when Pluto came online. And Pluto I equate to the raw nuclear power planet, so to speak, which is the one half of that equation. And then it's followed by the sextiles in the 40s, the 70s, and now this level as well. So in 1930 to 33, first of all, is the start of the Great Depression. That's really rough throughout the whole world. And it's really where fascism was born out of that, because fascism needs that kind, I think, is my opinion, needs that kind of chaos and a period of distress to get these strong men to come in and suggest crazy things that people will follow them and so forth. And that in a way reflects the sort of the raw energy of astrology, where typically it is the 45s and the 90s, the harder aspects that are more troublesome. So from that perspective, I believe I looked at, which one did I look at? I think it's in 2060 when they square, I think, something like that. In case, you want to look further ahead for real trouble around Pluto-Neptune.
Not worrying about 2060 yet.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. So very interesting.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting that you mentioned the semi-square. So I skipped over that, but the semi-sextile of these two planets and the semi-square, both you can see interesting things happening at both of them. This is a very slow-moving cycle, so these minor aspects, you can still see real important things happening at those times. And so the semi-sextile, roughly 1914 to 1919, depending on the orb you use, is the First World War. And I mentioned that the electron was discovered at the conjunction. At the semi-sextile, the proton was discovered. Right, so
okay.
The second element of the atom discovered at the semi-sextile. Semi-square, as you mentioned, it was exact, I think, 1930 to 1932. Semi-square, the neutron was discovered. So we had the three elements kind of coming into place at these aspects. And yes, as you mentioned, you had Hitler's takeover of Germany at that semi-square, which is, and then of course we get to the sextile, and we have the war itself. The interesting thing is you can also trace Nazism back to the conjunctional period. Particularly the kind of occult underpinnings of Nazism. There's a lot of people know, there was a kind of sort of dark spiritual element to Nazism.
Yeah, but now you mentioned that, you see, with Pluto, when you think of Pluto-Neptune, it's the idea of Neptune is a very visionary kind of energy where you imagine something that could be, that you then would incarnate. Pluto is the classic fascist. I mean, that's the idea of domination. So the idea that Hitler would be born then and feel like I need to, there need to be one person, one central power controlling everything. It goes really well with Pluto-Neptune. Let's just say that it's a perfect fit.
Yeah,
yeah,
it does. And there were also some. What's also interesting, I don't know if you've ever read Carl Jung's essay on the Nazis. He wrote a very interesting essay in the 1930s, I believe it was, about the Nazis, about the kind of the sort of occult origins and psychological nature of Nazism. And he focused on how he thought that Nazism was some kind of cult of Wotan. Wotan, or Odin, this Norse god, the god of war and magic, among other things. And you can actually, and a lot of Nazis were quite explicitly evoking Wotan. Now, interestingly, you can trace this back to the conjunctional period, the late 19th century. You had these kind of some certain Germanic thinkers who started to get interested in Wotan at that time, and this period is also the first period where they started to use the symbol of the swastika as well. So you can also see and trace that back then. The other interesting thing is Wotan is has been seen as is an analog of Mercury. Wotan, which is where we get Wednesday from, which is Wednesday, Mercury.
Interesting.
And this conjunction, this Pluto-Neptune conjunction, is in Mercury's sign of Gemini. So there's all sorts of weird kind of stuff going on, kind of under the hood. Pluto-Neptune is fundamentally, it has to do with deep beliefs about the world and stuff. And
True.
One thing that was born is these kind of Nazi beliefs. The other interesting thing that was born at that time was Zionism as well. Theodor Herzl. You can trace that back to the 1890s as well. So that's also born. And interestingly, what happens in the 1940s? We have the Second World War. We have the full fruit of Nazism, and we also have the foundation of Israel at that time as well, from its origins in the conjunctional period. So there's so much you can see through this cycle. It's kind of crazy, actually. It's been really interesting, kind of digging into it. But so what to take from that, I'll leave that to the viewers to think about. But it does seem like we're coming back to this sort of tense time, really. And the other thing, by the way, as well, I think is worth pointing out is in the 1890s, we also saw the first attempts to create a kind of world government, a world parliament. If you sort of do some research, look at like world government in Wikipedia, you'll see that there was this convention of a world parliament for the first time in that late 19th century period, where the Pluto-Neptune conjunction is beginning. And what happens in the 40s, when this period here, after the war, we get the establishment of the UN system, Bretton Woods, all that kind of thing. We get this sort of this kind of first attempt at a universal system. And then we look at this.
When was the?
When was the?
Because you said
after the Second World War.
After the Second World War, so it's during the sextile.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly, and then so it's interesting. We have that system established here when we get to the start of this this aspect, and then when the planets separated from the sextile here around 1991, where we have the fall of the Soviet Union, we have a kind of, it's like a sort of new, like there was some sort of reversal or some new global system, which was actually more one where and the United States was kind of more dominant, right? It was the sole superpower. And this is why I also kind of think that's what this cycle, one of the things this cycle is concerned with, the world system. And so is there some new world system kind of going to be negotiated over this next period? And then we come out of this, when the sextile starts to separate, we've kind of got some new global settlement. That's another thing that I'm wondering about, really.
Well, the thing is, to me, the takeaway is that if we want to be optimistic, is let's put our faith in the fact that it is a sextile, so that hopefully good things will come out of it. I mean, even when you look at the previous, if you look at, for example, 49 to 59, that's in the post, it is a Cold War, but it's in the post very destructive period when the world is grappling with what just happened. And if anything, it's reorganizing itself and things are basically moving forward. And in 75 to 87, there were a lot of worries, but again, we got through it. So let's hope that, as you say, it correlates, with those advances and that world order. I mean, think about it right now. In the world order, we have the United Nations, but they don't really respect it. They don't, too many countries are too interested in their own affairs. And if there were more truth, when people are discussing what they're going to do, you have to keep the other side in mind. There seems to be this, right now we seem to be at this point, I'm hoping it's near the end, cross my fingers, this idea that everything is I win, you lose. There's no sense that we need to meet halfway in order to resolve problems. And until that happens, how could you have a world panel like the United Nations, China, Russia? They're basically playing political games at this point. So something has to change for that to ever be, true. But it would be well, let's hope that Andre is right. The other Andre. Let's hope.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're right, though. It is a sextile, right? It's not like you'd be more worried if we were, we had the square coming up.
Well, I mean, look at how nasty the semi-square was. A worldwide major problem everywhere. There was this famine. I mean, it came on right after the Roaring 20s. Boom! Everything collapsed. All kinds of things went wrong, including that the discovery of Pluto, which tends to happen when planets are first discovered, takes a while for things to settle out. And I would consider that probably the most difficult and dangerous moment of that century in those years. So that mirrors the semi-squares. Some consider them minor. I consider them, the 248 series is pretty noticeable. You can tell in your own chart. When I follow my chart, I can tell when the moon is 45 versus when it's 40. It's pretty obvious, that there's a frictional thing happening versus a smooth type of energy. So.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. The semi-square is no joke.
Right, exactly. And especially when you're dealing with big orbits like this, it'll have more impact because it's rare. So it really, identifies a period as being important.
Yeah. The other thing that I think we can maybe be another sort of grounds for more hopeful thinking. If we go back, I'll just go back to the chart for a second. If we just look at the basket again, can you see the chart?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, so part of this configuration is this Uranus Neptune sextile as well. So that's the first major aspect of the Uranus Neptune cycle that began in 93, around then. So this early 90s time. And that was, I think, it was, I think for a lot of the world, that was a pretty good time. And it was like a time of quite a hopeful time. I think it was, the wall had come down, the Soviet Union had disintegrated. I mean, obviously that was very difficult for a lot of people in Russia, for example, living through that period. I think seeing everything collapse.
Yeah.
Don't want to kind of ignore that. It wasn't necessarily good for everybody, but it was also the time of the World Wide Web, right? That's another part of this.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a certain sense of Neptune being kind of oneness and connectivity, sort of connectivity with Uranus, the technology and so on. We have this, suddenly there's this network that's connecting everybody. And it was a hopeful time, and there was a lot of kind of deals done that kind of unified countries. I mean, the EU, of course, goes back to that period. NAFTA goes back to that exact period. Now, I'm not arguing those things were like universal goods, but in an archetypal sense, they were kind of about,
Yes.
There was some sense of unifying and harmonizing and kind of creating some sort of bigger network and playing field and that kind of thing.
Yes.
So that,
yes.
That cycle, that feeling is also is also actually going to be somehow realized at this sextile. So there is some sense, I think, we've got to factor that in, that there is maybe some sense of connectivity and unification and those kind of themes. That might be.
If I may, just a quick comment. I checked, and this is in a way, it's pretty funny. The 40-degree Uranus-Neptune was 2014, 2015, and then from 17 to 20, it was semi-square. You have to laugh because that's when, we had Brexit and then the Trump years, which, I mean, I lived through those years here, just complete and utter chaos around government and, the way people were feeling. And then in 2020, then it separates, and so now we're moving into the sextile. So that's an example, again, where the harsher aspects, because in the pre-Trump years, in a way, yes, there was tension, but it was basically people fell asleep, and then they woke up in a pretty major way around the tension of the semi-square.
Yeah. The other, I mean, I think like the technology is obviously a big part of this picture as well. Technology and the internet and probably AI. If we go back to the chart that I was showing you, the sextile chart, just to show you again. So looking at this thing again, 1947 was a very big year as well. 1947, the sextile is getting very close here, and there's a Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 1947. 1947 is one of the most important years of the 20th century, I think. One of the things, for one of the main reasons, this is the year of the invention of the transistor, and that really kind of enables the computer revolution that followed. And you can again see this piece of electrical technology that's so like transformative coming into being when this sextile is getting close. So all these cycles that we're looking at, they all have to do with information technology to a extent. There's also a theme that's running through them. I'm going to show you something kind of interesting. If I can you see the map that I've brought up?
Not yet. Right now it's showing Pluto, Neptune, and sextile still. Okay, there, yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is an interesting diagram. This is what's called the all red line. Right, this is something that the British built in the late 19th century. So they were building this, and they inaugurated in, I think it was 1902. This is a global electrical telegraph network. Really? And they built this is the first global electrical network, right? They built this thing, and they had undersea cables, you can see, going under the Atlantic and then the Pacific. And this was in the conjunctional period. So it's really funny because you can kind of see this archetypal kind of internet almost, right? This is another signal we could have picked up at that time. There will be a global network that uses electricity. It's so fascinating to see that. Then if we look at in 1965, Pluto-Uranus conjunction, we have the creation of ARPANET, which is kind of the forerunner of the internet.
Right.
Maybe not 1965, but that period when those planets were in orb of conjunction. We have the kind of next incarnation of this thing. This is ARPANET. This is a map showing that. this was by the 70s, but this thing is built in the 1960s. This is the forerunner of the internet. Then if we go to 1993, this Uranus-Neptune conjunction, we have the World Wide Web, right? So there's all these cycles are just speaking to the creation of this technology. And so I really think that one of the big themes of 2026 and what this basket is pointing to is something to do with the potential of technology, and probably AI has got something big to do with it. One thing that I find interesting is the potential for AI to completely destroy boundaries between people who speak different languages. I don't know if you've seen that they have this AI program now that can, not program, that's a very old term, but this AI, right? This,
right. AI engine,
this AI thing that can it can basically take a video of you and it can translate it into any kind of, a different language, but it'll also change how your mouth moves. So it looks like exactly like you're speaking that language, and it changes it even makes sure it keeps your accent. So it even sounds like it's like your voice, but you're speaking a different language, but it looks like you're really speaking it. And this is the kind of thing that makes me think, like, what could that do? You could have a conversation with, like, I don't know, a Chinese person in Guangzhou, and just have a conversation, and to you it's in English and to them it's in Chinese, and suddenly you're exchanging in a way that has never been possible before.
By the way, you can see how on the upside this is wonderful, because whether you tell me about the original lines through the oceans in the late 19th century, that's an attempt to connect everyone. Now, that's a great idea. The problem is that, like anything in life, you run into problems with it. People start to lay out their parcels and all that. But the idea is that it's great because you're connecting people in new ways. So what could be fabulous if I could connect with someone of a different culture? Absolutely. And then we can start thinking of all the things that are not so good around that, right? So, but it's always like that.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So there are really there's really reasons to be kind of hopeful, I think, and a lot potential, and then reasons to be cautious as well. And that's kind of just the nature of the times, the darkness and the light. I think it's also kind of quite mercurial, in that Mercury it's kind of neither benefic or malefic, as the way in the terms that they use in traditional astrology. When Mercury is with the benefics, Mercury's benefic, and when Mercury's with malefics, Mercury's malefic. And the planet Mercury, it's tidally locked with the sun, so one half is always light and the other half is always dark. You can even see it in the astronomy. So there's this light and darkness thing. It's very, very mercurial, and I think it kind of runs through the times, the dualities. There's all these dualities in this modern world, and even in politics, it's always, even if it doesn't mean much these days, as it's split like the left and the right, and kind of it runs through everything, and it's really core to like the nature of our times.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. It's very true. Yeah, absolutely. The mercurial, and it probably also links with the Mercury as primarily as an air sign planet. I mean, it's connected to Gemini and Virgo, but Gemini seems to be the more pure Mercury, and the separately those Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions that are now going to be in air for the next 200 years, and they've been in Earth for the last 200 mostly, signifying land and property and conquering and all that, more than the more intellectual side. But interestingly, the one conjunction in Libra in 1980 was the advancement of computers, for example, which is a much more air type of connection. So yeah, you can see the potential here being enormous, but there's the duality, right? And you're always wondering whether one side gets an advantage, or maybe it's just the way it always is, that you need both sides. Kind of like how you said earlier, you need more than one point of view in terms of countries. Perhaps that's the same, within governments and within societies. Maybe it's inescapable.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly in our current times, like, it's just about like the nature of the times is the endless sort of attempts to reconcile dualities. Like it's like that idea of dialectics. It's action, reaction, and or thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's kind of how the times are made. There's this just endless kind of opposition between different polarities, and then the world is made through that pressure. It's hard for us to imagine it being any other way, but I suspect that is maybe the nature of these mercurial times with these Pluto-Neptune conjunctions in Gemini. I don't know, we don't know what it felt like to live in like the first millennium BC or whatever it is, or whatever year you want to pick, but like I'm not sure that it was always characterized, the world wasn't really like this. It wasn't so based on dualities and oppositions and so on. So yeah, I think it's just the nature of the times, and we have to accept it.
Yes, I agree. I totally agree. And yeah, I mean, for instance, I'd rather see Uranus and Pluto in a trine than I would in a square during this period coming up, even though there's always potential for things to go wrong. So it's curious that, following up on what you said, the conjunction of Uranus and Neptune, that's the 93, 94. Uranus and Pluto were trining in 95, 96, 97. That was actually when I remember the internet literally exploded in terms of, that was sextile, sextile. So that was when I remember my first internet account was 95, and each year it became more and more interconnected, and then it grew into the next decade and so forth. But that was literally the start, mid-90s, of people actually having accounts and using email, in a significant way. There were some that were using it before that, but it really grew during that sextile. So perhaps the trine will be even better. Perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, you do have to think like all these harmonious aspects. It kind of bodes well. The only other element that there's a couple of things I would bring up that kind of maybe counterpoints as well, is just that the late 2020s, early 2030s, we're gonna have Uranus in Gemini, as you can see in this basket configuration, and there has been a correlation with the United States with Uranus in Gemini, in that the United States is kind of big transformative wars have kind of come with Uranus in Gemini. Have the Revolutionary War when the country is born, and then you have the Civil War, and then you have the Second World War. Each time it's been Uranus in Gemini. I don't know which chart you like to use for the United States, but in the Sibley chart, Gemini, Sibley chart, that's then Gemini is the 7th whole sign house. The house kind of, you can see opposition and all the opponents and so on.
Yeah, I like to use the. You probably have come across the work of that Frenchman Gacquelin, he saw that when planets cross the angle, even though in the conventional quadrant system they're on the cadence side, they're actually stronger. And that's my opinion as well from doing lots of astrology. And Uranus is the planet in the US chart that last crossed an angle, thereby stamping its mark on the US. And I recently heard, it's more like 2 or 3 years ago, but one of those podcasts with the Freakonomics people, and they were saying that the best predictor of behavior is actually nationality, and they mentioned that the US is an intensely individualistic country, whereas, for instance, China is intensely collective in the way they behave. And yeah, the US is practically reckless Uranus, in my opinion. It's taken too far, but it's a perfect fit. So, to your point.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt, the US is the Uranian country par excellence, right? It's the country of freedom, and it's very, very, very Uranian. The interesting thing as well about the US, if I can just show you. So we looked at the Pluto Neptune conjunction here at 8 Gemini, 1891 and 1892. So that is a hot degree. This 8 Gemini.
That's where Uranus is. Yeah.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. It's like if we I just bring up the chart of the United States, the Sibley chart, you can see the interesting. So if I just change the
display points.
Well, this is the Sibley chart. It's not how you normally see it, because I've got Aries as the first house and I'm not displaying fast planets. But the point is, you can see here Gemini. This is actually the 7th whole sign house of this chart. And there's Uranus at 8 Gemini, right? It's right at that. It's at the precise degree of the Pluto-Neptune conjunction. So that really, to me, speaks to the United States' kind of unique, important role in this cycle, as a kind of Uranian influence somehow as well. It's, to me, it's really notable that it was the US that developed the atomic bomb, right? And so that was something that was promised as part of this cycle, I think, with the birth of atomic physics at the conjunction. It's the country with Uranus at that degree. So I think, the US has a real special role, I think, as a kind of a force of kind of sort of revolutionary force, really. I mean, I think the big transformations of the world have really mostly kind of come from the United States. I think many people would argue with that. And so, yes, it's like this is kind of this cycle, the US is kind of very important to it. And also to I think, Uranus being a planet of technology as well, the kind of so much of the technology that's driving change is coming out of the United States.
Yeah, and this is where, again, we swing back to, I don't know if I want to call it pessimism, but lots of caution, because, the Saturn, Neptune in Aries, and then Uranus in Gemini, it just looks so much like the Civil War in the 1860s. Saturn was in Libra then, but it's still pretty similar, because the idea is those planets, they also put pressure on the US Cancer planets, those first up to 13 degrees, you're squaring, it's more challenging. And so I don't know exactly which way it's going to go, but I can't imagine it being completely smooth with a Uranus return like that to a place where it has consistently shown up as having to get through a conflict. Let's put it that way. On the plus side, where I say disagree with people who point to these periods and say, oh, this is it, this is the end, I just say, well, no, we got into these before and we came out okay. It was difficult, but, in the end, the good guys mostly won, the battle. And that's my hope.
Yeah, I mean, the US kind of came out of all those conflicts kind of ultimately stronger, right? There's no doubt about that. I don't think that we don't need to go to worst case scenarios, but it's you have to reckon with that is probably going to be a feature of these coming years. There's something there. What exactly the conflict might be, it's a bit harder to say. As you say, it's kind of, there's some things about it that look a bit like the Civil War, Neptune being in Aries and so on. But then obviously there's a lot of geopolitical tension as well. So it's a bit hard to pick, because you can kind of obviously see there's a lot of division in the United States as well. So that is probably a part of the story in some sense, but what exactly it will be is hard to say. So it's kind of, if you're coming from an American perspective, it's kind of these different sort of things to reconcile, right? You've got Barbeau saying, yes, this is the best astrology of the century, a beautiful world civilization is coming into being here. But then you've also got the knowledge of kind of what tends to happen with Uranus in Gemini. So yeah, there's different things to reconcile. There's a couple of and I think we also have to factor in that there could be some really weird and unexpected things that come in the next few years. AI, for one, I think it's just a really unpredictable technology. I think it will have, I don't think we can imagine what effects it will have. It'll probably do things to society in the world that we just didn't see coming, really unexpected things that we couldn't have predicted. The printing press was the if we look back at the last Pluto-Neptune cycle, the printing press appeared in the mid-15th century, which is the sextile of that Pluto-Neptune cycle. And it appeared almost at kind of the same time as the transistor, like relatively in the cycle. So like what the printing press was to the last cycle, the transistor is the current cycle. And the printing press, I mean, it's hard to calculate how that affected the world, but it obviously transformed it in a profound way. Huge, yeah.
That's
huge.
I mean,
and it was, it had even in spiritual terms, it was important because it kind of drove the Reformation, it drove the birth of Protestantism, this whole new Christian faith, and that had huge effects on world history. And I think we'll see the similar things with AI and the consequences of the transistor. Like it's not just, we can look at things in a very like kind of material sense, but there's also like there are spiritual undercurrents to things. Like technology is not just stuff. It's not just kind of matter. Like it changes. I think it changes how we think. It changes our spirit. So it kind of has it's almost, I do believe that that idea that technology itself is kind of a form of magic in a sense, especially information technology, which is so concerned with symbols and words. Like, I think the way that the world's going to change is it's very hard to predict, but there could be strange consequences that we don't see coming that suddenly make all this astrology make sense.
No, it's true. It's true. And when you say magic, I mean, think about it. I often try to do these thought experiments. Imagine that if you were living in even 1890, but certainly a century before, and you were transported into today's world, it would take you a while to think, holy smoke, look at this. I just flip this and the light turns on and then the entire city is connected, and that's pure magic. They'd have to think about, what are they doing? And yes, there's a logic to it, but it's a pretty major infrastructure advance. And technology, as we know, tends to be not so much linear. There's a the curve accelerates upon itself. It's like when they're discovering CPU power, it doubles every so many years because you use the current technology to multiply your effect. So it's entirely possible that 10 years from now, we're in a really, really different world, really different, where we have to adapt to all kinds of new things. Yes, I think so, 100%.
And if you don't mind me getting a bit weird just for a bit.
You mean you haven't been weird so far? Okay.
No, you haven't seen anything yet. I'm holding back quite a bit, but
okay. So get even more weird.
Switched weird on, yeah. But no, I mean, the other potential, I think, kind of Deus ex machina that might flip things in weird and unpredictable ways is also the UFO phenomenon as well, which I mentioned dates back to the conjunctional period. It dates back to these mystery airships in the 1890s, at least the technological incarnation of it does. What was the other thing that emerged? We looked at this sextile chart to just show you that again. We go back to our Pluto-Neptune sextile chart. You can see it comes into orb in the 1940s. We have nuclear technology. We have the transistor. But what else do we have? We have the birth of the sort of the modern, or the appearance of the flying saucer. Right, 1946, 47. Suddenly see the saucers even in the Second World War. There were the appearance of these strange lights that have been called the Foo Fighters. That's where the band gets its name. Both the Allies and the Axis, they were seeing these strange lights from their planes. They thought they would belong to the other side, and they called them the Foo Fighters in the US. But 1947, have the flying saucer, basically huge numbers of flying saucer sightings. And this period of the 50s was also a real, the flying saucer mythos was very strong in that period. 1952, I think we had the appearance of these discs around the Washington DC, around the Capitol, and really this whole period, as well as being the period of the Cold War, was kind of the golden age of ufology, of belief in flying saucers and so on. what also happened in this big dip, where I said, the Cold War kind of, well, it ended, and there was this period where we weren't suddenly threatened by nuclear weapons, at least not so much. There's also the UFOs kind of disappeared from the imagination a little bit. Nobody, I remember reading articles and people saying, how come nobody gets abducted anymore, and why does nobody care about UFOs anymore? It faded away,
right?
And it's coming back.
Back.
You've seen all this stuff that's happened in Washington with this guy David Grush, this supposed whistleblower who's claiming that the US has crashed craft. I don't know if that's true or not. We don't know, but he said it under oath in Congress. So either it is true, or there's some very strange kind of intelligence operation going on that's intended to somehow make us think that things are happening that aren't happening. Either way, very strange things are going on in that area. And Grush appeared when Pluto entered Aquarius. It did its little stint in Aquarius earlier this year. Pluto's going back into Aquarius next year, and I really expect this topic to kind of only get more and more prominent. So I don't know the realities of it. I do believe that there's something there.
Well, I tell you what, if you want a new world order really quickly, that's exactly what you need. Is that the Martians land, and then everything is completely realigned. Do I think probably not? But anything is possible, because that would be a total game changer. I don't know though, with that whole the Area 51, the whole thing. I just don't know how to grapple with it around what I know about the astronomy. It just doesn't make any sense to me on the spaceship, an actual spaceship, the way we think a spaceship would be, going through, flying around, leaving orbit, entering orbit. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but who knows? Maybe, there's a race somewhere that would have an interest in coming here for some reason or other, maybe. I don't know.
Well,
reserved
actually, if you get into this subject, firstly, it's a crazy hall of mirrors where, it's hard to separate fact from fiction. There's a lot of disinformation in it. There's a lot of strange things going on and a lot of nonsense. But there is some kernel, I think, of there is something real is happening. People experience things. Mm-hmm. I certainly believe that. But we don't know what this thing is, right? There's only the well-known theory is that these are kind of coming from other planets, but actually there are a lot of other possibilities that a lot of people today are kind of thinking are even more possible. Maybe they come from some sort of parallel dimension somehow, or parallel realms.
That makes more sense. That makes more sense. The only thing is, though, that if you say that, then the next level is, do you also have to be on that dimension? And usually that would be a consciousness dimension, rather than you come from another dimension and then you appear in this physical dimension so that we can all, go to the public square and see the spaceship. That's the part that is hard to imagine. Yeah. It's always like someone has seen it somewhere, but no one can ever say, well, no, everybody saw it. Look, here's the picture at the local shopping mall, or, something really big. That's never happened. Like, has there ever been a UFO that landed on a soccer stadium with 100,000 people watching? No, that's never happened. And so my feeling would be that the separate dimension is also a dimension more of consciousness than of bodily matter, so to speak.
Yeah, there have been, to be fair, there have been some mass sightings, but nothing on the scale that you just mentioned. No UFO landing in a stadium, and there have definitely been sightings of seen by a lot of people. But yeah, as you say, where this gets weird is there are two real kind of elements to the phenomenon. There's the kind of nuts and bolts theory, which is the idea that these are actual physical craft. The US has them. They're trying to figure out how they work, all that kind of stuff. That's what we call nuts and bolts. And then there's the consciousness aspect, because there's a lot of other suggestion that this is maybe a phenomenon of consciousness or spirit, that these are maybe just a new incarnation of the kind of spiritual entities which have interacted with human beings forever. And so there's what is really slippery about the phenomenon is that it seems to do both things. There are physical traces of of craft. There's all these claims that they really do have craft and so on. But then there's also all this stuff kind of about psychic effects. A lot of experiences kind of see it more as a spiritual experience, than a kind of encounter with physical entities. So this is where it all gets really weird. And I think the only smart and reasonable position is like, we just don't know what's going on with it, what it really is. But what I will say, what I am sure about is that there is something. It's not just people mistaking weather balloons or all these kind of dismissive kind of explanations that have been offered in the past. There's something happening. There is a phenomenon, and I'm sure, and it's definitely correlated with this cycle. And this cycle is a cycle of consciousness. So, where it also gets messy because there's also quite clearly a lot of involvement of intelligence agencies in this area. They're very concerned with it. There's a lot of the figures that that are prominent in ufology as well. They have intelligence connections and so on. I think so. It really gets murky and messy, and who knows what's going on. But another possibility is that there's some kind of new belief system or new faith kind of coming into being around this. And parties are trying to manipulate that. They want they want to stay somewhat in control of what people believe about this phenomenon, because it will have could have very unpredictable consequences.
Yeah, you can say that again. Yeah, no, I mean that's the whole thing, that you can understand why. This is why there's a big question mark. You could understand why, if there were something, why a government would be very reluctant to let that out, given the tremendous upheaval that you could promote, you could make happen. So yes, it makes perfect sense. It's just I'm still working on trying to understand the notion of space travel on a physical level, how incredibly difficult it is to do without getting into things like wormholes and or things like Star Trek will just beam me down type thing, stuff that's so beyond our comprehension that it doesn't feel like it's going to happen anytime soon. So it's difficult to understand how that would work, but I remain open. I mean, anything is possible, and I would rather have trines and sextiles, put it that way. If I saw everything square, everything, then I'd say they're gonna land, they're gonna conquer us. It's gonna be like that show in the 80s where they landed and then they were eating the people, they were using them for food. That would be multiple squares and oppositions, and right.
Yeah. I mean, all my I see. Well, what can you say? I mean, I think it is a part of the kind of complex brew of the times. It's something. It's a part of the story of the next few years, in my opinion. I think we'll hear a lot more about it. What it really is, where it really leads, who knows?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we'll find out. I mean, that part, there's no question. I mean, there are so many cycles that go along with these as well that you have to factor in. Like Neptune has been in Pisces since 2011. It's going to get out into Aries. And on the one hand, that could be all the issues that it will deal with, being in Aries, being next to Saturn and all of that. But I noticed Neptune in Pisces, the duality of Pisces, both because it's a dual sign, but also the duality of any planet. I understand planets have a range. They function really well or really poorly. Neptune on the high end is a very spiritual planet, and the explosion in spiritual information availability in the last decade has been phenomenal. It's been wonderful on video. I mean, you can find everything. I used to go to the occult shop, and find the book somewhere with some mention or something. Now you find it in a video in different ways. But at the same time, disinformation, the other side of that, it's grown tremendously as well in the last decade, to the point where, fake news, who knows what's true. Neptune is getting out of Pisces. We have to see what that does. That's one example of a pretty major switch. And then there's Pluto moving from a governmental sign, Capricorn, into Aquarius, which, to my mind, Aquarius is a more people sign. It doesn't align well with fascistic impulses. That's why Pluto in Cancer was more suitable for that when we had the rise of fascism in the 30s. That's the opposite sign. So Cancer, Capricorn to me are prone to those type of movements. And those two alone, just getting out is really significant, even if you don't tie them to anything, putting them in new signs. And so we're getting these different movements, but we're getting Neptune changing signs, Saturn changing signs, and Uranus changing signs as well, right? So that's a lot. That's a lot of planetary energy shifting.
It is, yeah. And so that's the next couple of years, 2 or 3 years, is going to be kind of interesting when you've got all those outer planets right at the end of the signs, and in the last degrees. Does look kind of volatile. Might be an interesting ride.
Yeah, no.
What other?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say one other possibility that kind of strikes me, that I'm kind of thinking a little bit about, is what if we get everything we want, and we get this sort of we get peace, and we get like an AI, the technology advances so much that we're sort of able to, say, plug into amazing virtual worlds, and kind of we get into a realm of post-scarcity and all that kind of stuff that the AI proponents they like to claim. It seems unrealistic, but let's just say that, I think one risk with this technology is that it might be almost too good, in the sense that we're here to, in my opinion, my belief is that we're here to learn lessons, to grow spiritually. I don't know how you can do astrology and not kind of come to some sort of perspective like that. And so what if we're able to just create realities using this technology, which almost just, we stop growing because of them? Because you can already see it a little bit with phones. People are, when they're sort of stuck on their phones, they're not bored because they've got endless stimulation, right? But you're not really growing, are you? You're just kind of like, sort of, it's almost like you're taking a drug that's kind of keeping you a little bit entertained, but you're not truly living. And that's a little bit my worry, that like things go well, but then the real the next challenge is a spiritual one, in terms of like, how do we is this technology good for us, and do we really need it, and does it enable spiritual and human flourishing in a sort of the profound way that we probably want?
Yeah, well, that you're almost pointing to, that's like saying it's now the iPhone, and you're pointing to the super duper iPhone, right? Where it's so good that everyone is totally addicted to the technology. But then, see, there you get into something different, wisdom itself, which would be that anything you keep your mind on is ultimately, that's not the truth. This is like how people will say, well, I had a great experience. I saw whatever, some great vision. Well, yeah, but that's what you saw then. Now you're here, so you had to let go of that vision. There is no experience that truly can do it for you. You have to let them all go. That's the more true spirituality. So maybe that has to be taught and informed and brought into the world more, or simultaneous with the increase in these, in these ideas. It's a little bit like now everyone in a way is all stressed out, and you see a huge industry in helping people to de-stress because it's being identified. People say, look, this is affecting your dopamine levels. You're staring at your phone. Then you create a dopamine circuit. That's not good because of A, B, C, D. Change it to this other thing. And so in a way, you might even say that the final, or one of the final conclusions to all this, is that when all is said and done, that how you said something about earlier, I caught you in a way pointing indirectly to that Pareto principle, where, that mathematician that discovered that the 80-20 rule, that 20% of the people own 80% of the wealth, or that even we wear 20% of the, how does it work? 80% of the time we wear 20% of our clothes. It's this thing where things just move in a certain way, so that only a certain number of people can figure it out. Maybe in every civilization, some people will get it and some people won't. In other words, we get this period coming up. Maybe you could even go back to all the periods. Go back to the 1940s. Some people were thriving and some were not. Overall, the world was in a terrible place, but lots of people got by. Recent pandemic, many people did phenomenally well. Many people did not. And so in a way, it's up to the individual to discover and, how do you align with these movements to get the best result for yourself. And then there will be many that will be that way and many that won't, because it'd be a pretty sad world if, what you say is true. So we get AI, and now I hope that I don't spend my entire day, surfing the alternative world, and I'm that's all it is. I hope not. I mean, I guess I'm open to anything, but how do you feel about that, based on what you know so far about your life?
Well, I would like to think that I'd have the spiritual wisdom not to do that, but I'll be honest, I spend too much time on my phone as it is, and I've played a lot of video games in my time and all that kind of stuff. I don't spend much time doing that now, but I would not be too surprised if I was pretty tempted by these things, because they're going to make these technologies as entertaining as possible, and they're going to be very powerful. And you can imagine that future sort of virtual technologies are going to be able to just plunge us into quite amazing, immersive worlds where we can interact with people, where it's much more, we're just, the way we're talking now over Zoom, what they're aiming for is kind of the ability to interact with people as if it feels real. And I don't think it'll ever maybe feel 100% real, but it's going to get very good. And I think, like, one of the main themes of this cycle, I've kind of, in one of my videos, I really framed it as kind of spirit and science. Because if you look back to this big cycle, this Pluto-Neptune cycle, 1890s and so on, we have this explosion of technology, but we also have a kind of a new way to relate to spirit. And I think ultimately this big cycle, maybe what it's really about is kind of reconciling technology and spirituality. And I think there's going to be temptations to do it the wrong way. And yeah, it's something we're all going to have to wrestle with probably eventually. And I think it's important to know thyself, basically, to be very self-aware.
Correct. Yeah, that's the thing, that if you talk about, for instance, great technology around biofeedback, helping you to, for example, more effectively access the types of energies that great Buddhist monks access, or that kind of thing. That's great. It's what you're talking about around the danger would be the unreality, the delusional side, where you're lost in a kind of joined space where you're not even developing anymore. Well, first of all, in your chart, your Saturn-Neptune square will protect you, so you don't have to worry about anything. You're going to be fine. Saturn will scream if you start to, really go off the rails. It'll say, "Come back to reality." I mean, the thing about Saturn is that aside from all the problems it may bring about, and it brings about plenty, it is the most realistic planet. One of my theories is that it's a foundation of all religions. Through the focus, discipline, energy you need to apply in order to give birth to planets like Jupiter, Neptune. Any planet needs the Saturn, channel. And if you've got it, actually, in your case, it's a T-square, so even more to the point. That Neptune, right? Maybe I'm saying too much. Is it bad to?
No, it's fine. I don't mind you telling people I've got a Saturn Neptune square. No, I feel grateful for that. Honestly, there's been a lot of times when I've been able to kind of pull back from the brink of kind of going too far in various Neptunian ways. There's always a point where part of me will say, no, let's get it together, and let's not cross the line. Let's stay grounded.
Well,
and I think that's
you're using it brilliantly. You're using it from what you're doing with these cycles and with your connection to astrology. That's a brilliant use of Saturn, Neptune. There's a tension there, but there's a constant, trying to grapple with it, organize it, keep it together. It's great. It's great. Yours would be, at least on that level. There could be other things that I don't know about, but just on this, you're doing phenomenally well. Venus, Neptune, with Saturn in the middle, and Saturn also is connected to Capricorn and the historical, the past. It rules time. So the idea of looking back to see what happened and then what is projected forward is very Saturnian as well. So, and then in Virgo, very analytical, obviously lots of detail, which you certainly are displaying in spades. Good for you. It's really good. Really excellent. I think you're very phenomenal.
Thank you, Andre.
So I guess we should leave it at that for this, but I look forward to future talks because I think we could explore some interesting topics, especially if you'd like to talk about maybe things that are going on at any point in the current world, and to relate them to prior points, because you'll probably have access to that information, right?
Yeah, I'd be very glad to. No, it's been a fun conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Likewise, definitely, yes. All right, well, we'll stop there and we'll say goodbye to everyone for now.